So terrific day. Thank you so much to Richard and all the team for setting this up. Thank you to Andy and all of those of you who've travelled such a long way to get here. Just the beginning of 3 days of repeated issues coming up. Just some of that last discussion I hope is going to get revisited a lot. So yeah, we just got half an hour or so from now before the first drink session. Well, not really the first, but then another drink session. And I'm going to try and speak for less than 10 minutes max, and then open up for you guys to, I hope, pick up on other things that are in your minds from today's talks. I'm not really going to be directed by the content of the talks today. I guess I'm picking up on some things in Andy's talk, but lots of things that came up today that you'll want to pick up. I just wanted to list a couple of things that did come up today that I'm not going to speak about, but which I hope will arise again tomorrow. Interesting little discussion this morning about pleasure, wasn't it? And I hope we'll hear some more about reward tomorrow. We want to hear some more about, what is it? What is the utility that is driving the precision weightings if it's not pleasure and reward? I was really enjoying the brief exchange between Andy and Dan Hutto about the content of generative models. I hope we'll hear a lot more about that, about how is it that we've got the kind of explicit grip on the structured world that Andy, as I see it rightly, is saying we need for a lot of complex cognitive tasks, and yet it's non-linguistic in form. It's not in any clear format that we're familiar with. I'm not going to talk about extended mind stuff, so what I'm going to talk about, kind of really just three little points. One about objectivity, one about the world, and one about explanation, and we'll see where that gets us. So I was just struck by Andy's mention of Jerry Fodor, one of the many things that Jerry Fodor would have been unhappy with in today's discussion. So our homage could be to pick up on Fodor's worries. So this arose in Andy's talk today out of his description again of the kind of furiously active nature of the generative model and of its deeply history-dependent nature. So our cognitive processes on Andy's picture are profoundly kind of trajectory dependent. They can't go into regions that don't depend on their history, and they carry traces of our own individual idiosyncratic cognizer's history with us all the way down to the very beginning of the perceptual process. So this, I take it, as the kind of thing Andy was picking up on, and one of Jerry Fodor's great concerns about the dangers of relativism in some moods or of idealism in other moods, that if it's kind of all up to me what I perceive, if it's all dependent on my own pre-existing cognitive model, we lose the possibility of objectivity. We lose what Fodor thought of as necessary for realism. We lose, one might say, the possibility of common ground. And I guess, even certain earlier versions of Andy himself would have found some of his language about bringing a structured world into being slightly dubious on that ground. It's the kind of thing that you caught Varela, Thompson and Roche and many others for in the past. So, in this new framework, what are the alternative means of grounding objectivity, given the deeply idiosyncratic, personalized, history-dependent nature of the generative model, which is driving our perceptual and other cognitive processes? Okay, so that's the sort of objectivity thing, and it takes me to, I guess, the natural set of answers to that refers to the world, or to the body and the world, to things that are more or less in common. Our different cognitive systems are operating in the same world within limits, with some of the same linguistic and social and environmental constraints. More specifically, on Andy's picture, we individually and collectively are habitually, compulsively, you might say, setting up and incorporating rich sets of cues, more or less enduring social features, environmental features, resources of different kinds, which are sometimes necessary for the completion of different tasks. Other times they transform the way in which we can complete those tasks. But then, of course, those cues, those environmental structures, those routines, those habits, those social interactions are themselves very often deeply unique, deeply idiosyncratic, often with a longer cultural history than the peculiar ways in which our own little brains have been sculpted. So, as others might say, these are richly idiosyncratic cognitive ecologies within which our ongoing adjustment of precision weightings is going on. Different cognitive ecologies for different cognitive tasks, different balances between different external resources, and indeed between the internal and external resources in different situations. So, if the kind of internal wing, the neural wing in particular, of these radically heterogeneous cognitive ecologies is on the view that Andy defends, kind of using more or less the same principles, the same neural processes are in play across different cognitive domains and across different tasks. Then somebody, at least like Ed Hutchins, may well say, well, isn't it the world then that is bearing the explanatory weight in much of cognitive science? Isn't it the unique, idiosyncratic and historically specific external resource which are doing the work in understanding why different cognitive systems approach different cognitive tasks across different domains in different ways? So the idea is then that explanation gets shifted a little bit less towards the ongoing investigation of the peculiarities of precision rewiring in the brain, and more back towards the ecological situation. And specifically then, one might ask, and this has been addressed many times, well, in how many cases might there be something like direct external control, perhaps social control, perhaps environmental control, of the reweighting of the precision assessments? Direct external control by the world, by features of our cognitive niches, our affective niches, by cues, by routines, by others. So these are the kinds of things Andy's referring to, for example, as the kind of ways we rewire ourselves constantly, sometimes using self-talk, sometimes using other kinds of labels, other adjustments, other mechanisms for kind of dampening or amplifying the way that we assess the importance of different kinds of error. So given, in the way that Andy put this point strikingly this morning, the brain is engaged in a constant task-specific rewiring process. So the picture there is that the nature and the extent of the context sensitivity of each of our brain's cognitive processing is itself context sensitive, radically context sensitive. So context sensitivity isn't just there full stop, it's something itself that is constantly being rewired. But then again, doesn't the explanatory weight come down more on the context than on the internal processes that are responding to the context? So this is the third and last point I want to make about explanation. Even if Andy's right that there are some deeply unifying principles on show in this framework about the neural wings of the complex systems involving brains, bodies, and worlds that we're interested in, the nature of our understanding of the cognitive processes and the cognitive systems themselves isn't exhausted necessarily by those more or less unified understandings of the internal processes. And I think both Andy and others today have suggested, well, we don't really need to push too hard on the dramatic revolutionary unificatory rhetoric. We just want to be able to see new things in independently motivated, independent debates that are going on in other areas of the cognitive and, one might say, the social sciences, and treat the explanatory issues from a more pragmatic point of view. Okay, that's all I wanted to say. We're open up now to discussion. Please wait to have the microphones, because it's really important that for the discussion to be recorded for those who aren't able to be here. Please feel free to bring up other issues that came up today that are on your mind, or anything that came up today. So Ken, and we'll get a microphone to you in a minute. And I will keep a list of who's up. And please keep your questions and comments short today. We'll be able to return to things over the next few days. Thank you.
I'll make a small comment, putting on a biologist's hat. So this is reacting to John's statement about, or comment about the environment playing a big role, right? So there's a parallel, I would say, argument going on in actually evolutionary biology. So in a way, that's right, because it's the environment that shapes, that selects for genes which will carve up the cognitive system, and it's the environment that feeds ontogenetic experience. Right? Between that, you cover most of the bases, right? So that's sort of a classic view of evolutionary biology, but now there's a sort of a new view, a whole new view in evolutionary biology, arguing for things like niche construction and rapid evolution based on epigenetic changes and phenotypic plasticity and all that. So there's names like Eva Jablonka, Kevin Leyland, Orling Smee, and a bunch of others. So there's a new manifesto in place, and this is a raging argument in evolutionary biology. It looks like it has parallels to the arguments in cognition about the extent of environment versus organism.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, not just parallels. I mean, it's the same sets of arguments. Yeah. Thanks. Phil, what's next?
Just a comment on the last talk and the discussion with Jakob. I took the point about Markov blankets and the boundaries of the Markov blankets to be not a point about necessity, or necessarily the boundary of the mind is here. It's more that if you're trying to understand the mind, you see which Markov blanket is being most beneficial for the organism, minimising predictive error over the long-term average. Turns out it's an empirical matter of fact that it's the water of the brain. There might be occasions when it gets extended. If you get a prosthetic limb or something like that, then yeah, it's a bit extended. But on average, over the long term, that's just where it is, and it gels with, so it's a matter of empirical fact, what we know about the contribution of the brain to cognition.
Thank you. Michael, do you want to respond or just say you agree? Yeah. Okay. Jakob.
I guess this is kind of jump around a bit. So,
yeah, sure.
On your first point about how everything depends on the history and what has gone before and so on, to me at least it's important that Bayes' rule captures that. And sometimes that gets a little bit lost in some of this discussion. It becomes a bit nebulous to say, things depend on what has gone before, but we have a mathematical tool that says, here's exactly how much we should let the current inference depend on the past. That's given by the precision of the total set of priors. And it would be nice to make the Bayesian literature, and we heard about David earlier as well, to make more contact with some of those debates about history and context and so on.
Yeah, thanks. I suspect Andy will just agree with that point. I mean, so there's a sense in which you take history to actually wash out in explanatory practice many times. Is that right? So Andy was next on the list there.
Let's see if I can use this strangely. Just to pick up on a couple of things sort of from here and there. The objectivity stuff that you started with there. I think one thing that we really ought to do there is think about stuff like science. Just, why do we have peer review? We've wrapped all these structures around ourselves, which are structures that enable brains like ours, I don't think, find that sort of unbiased response natural, to behave as if they were much better scientists than they probably natively are. So I think you can go quite a long way towards restoring some semblance of objectivity by looking at those sorts of loops out. And of course, stuff is going to fit quite neatly, I think, with a predictive process in story there, because one of the things that seems to be happening is you sort of push stuff. You push a lot of the programming, if you like, out to the world. It's the world that installs the predictions that drive the behaviour. And so you're very much kind of sucking up stuff from the environment in that way all the time. So I think it's rather convivial to a sort of, environment could be doing an awful lot of the causal work kind of picture. And then the last comment, just on all that stuff about Markov blankets and so on, I kind of think that what I would like us to think about there a bit is something like, so the example that springs to mind for me are the metamorphic insects. So these creatures that kind of move through life, they go through forms that are radically different, yet we want to say that there is a free energy minimizing process at work there, and they kind of this process maintains itself over time by spawning a succession of different Markov blankets. And I think that's exactly what we're doing, but we shouldn't sort of lose sight of the importance of the active spawning. Somehow it's the active spawning that gets to tie stuff to you. So if there is a good answer for iPhones and so on, it's something like that, to sort of wrapping together into a kind of reliable problem-solving whole that comes to define me in some way. So that's the whole picture there. Yeah, so they were. That was yeah.
Richard and then Colin. Yeah.
I just have a quick finger to that.
Very
Just
quick,
a
Carol, yeah.
very quick comment.
Yeah.
I mean,
Take the microphone.
yeah.
You don't have to even think of metamorphosis, right? You can think of yourself, right? Because your cells are dying permanently, and you're creating your cells permanently, right? So
We might come new each day. Yeah?
Richard, yeah. This way, please.
Thanks. I'm actually going to talk a bit about mission construction and free energy tomorrow. I think you can make them work together, but I'm going to leave that till tomorrow. I think the Markov blanket controversy is a bit of a red herring as well. Again, I'll talk about that tomorrow. But the thing I wanted to just return us to was some of the things that Dave was talking about in his talk this morning, which is how should we think of predictive processing and free energy minimization as telling us anything about the mechanisms of the mind. So what's the difference between, just being a kind of set of linear equations, very nice as they are, kind of dynamical systems. Here are the nodes of the network. Here are the kind of trajectories and evolution that you can go through in the state space, and something that looks more like a mechanism sketch, something that you can say, these are the bits that are actually moving and doing the work. So I don't know whether anyone wants to take that up, but it seems to me that that's an important question in this discussion as well.
We will take that on notice. Thank you, Richard. Colin.
Yeah, I think this is a very similar point. And so one thing that struck me today, both coming from David's talk, but also in an exchange, a very brief exchange between Andy and Jakob, was the extent to which it does seem like there are a lot of free parameters that get evoked in practice, particularly things about precision. And it does seem like there's at least some disagreement about how these should be set. So on the one hand, Jakob seems to think that, I took it, that there ought to be a principled way to talk about hyperparameters or precision or things like that, whereas Andy was much closer to well, obviously for any particular task, you've got to figure out what the appropriate precision is. And you can see pros and cons for both of those. The latter one, on the one hand, it seems right, but on the other hand, it seems like it gives you a lot of flexibility to account for any data that you'd like. On the other hand, the principled ones, there are other things to say. So I think there are some bigger questions lurking in the background about, and along the same lines as Richard, about kind of what kind of scientific theory many of these things are. And I think probably different people have them as different ways. Is it more like a big picture idealization? Is it a modeling strategy that gets fleshed out? Is it meant to be a literal representation of certain processes? And I think that's very much up in the air, and there are a lot of good answers there, but I think it's probably important to give the same answer, at least for each person to give the same answer across different contexts and not collapse them together.
Any other comments? Dave?
This was just following up a bit on what Colin just said, and also Richard. Sorry, in terms of the sort of issue about free parameters. So I think I'm quite a neophyte relative to this group in terms of familiarity with these new forms of hierarchical predictive processing, but it seemed to me that one of the early powerful arguments in favor of a kind of hierarchical approach to predictive processing as opposed to sort of the kind of run-of-the-mill Bayesian kind of modeling was that you had an explanation for where the priors came from. And it was sort of like that argument that there was quite a lot of sort of powerful arguments being made against Bayesian modeling that this is a really powerful free parameter and we need to constrain it. And it seemed like the hierarchical predictive coding framework gave a really useful answer there. It seems like now things have, perhaps that question could be re-asked about the role of some of these additional parameters, and how do we, in sort of thinking about the models, where do the constraints come from?
I'm going to give Richard the last word and then we'll wrap it up for the day. Yeah.
wanted to clarify one thing I said just then about Markov blankets being red herrings. I think they're red herrings with regard to, you know, sort of the metaphysical questions that philosophers are interested in, right? So I don't think Markov blankets, as they're being used technically in the scientific literature, are going to give you the kind of metaphysical boundaries that matter for the standard kind of internal-external distinctions in philosophy of mind. I think they are idealizations. I think if you take them from their root in the work of Judea Pearl in machine learning, then what you're thinking of is something that's more like a Bayesian network. You're thinking of different states as part of the network, and then you're just partitioning them into internal and external states on the basis of that parent-child relationship that Michael went through. But I don't think that on its own is going to give you the kind of boundary that philosophers care about when they think about these states are special and mental and these states aren't, these are environmental.
Okay, so we start tomorrow morning at 9:30 a.m. We're back in the incubator tomorrow. Please be on time so we can get going. And I just want to thank all 4 speakers today. That was a really terrific set of talks. Thank you.